This morning, though, I want to talk to you guys about worship. We're people of worship. We all worship something. We're always in kind of a state of worship. I hope I don't make anybody feel awkward. I was not trying to point Roman out or make him feel awkward as far as the green and gold. I know some of you guys would be okay with this, and some of you guys, this drives you nuts. Because you think that green and gold should not be up here on a Sunday morning. But here's the unique part of it, and it does drive me nuts too. So I can't actually move all my sheets around, so that was just for that little part. But just so you guys know, we're people of worship, and we are also people that worships all the time. We worship at home, we worship at work, we worship at school, we worship here. And the prayer that I have, especially for myself, is that my heart would be at the same place on a Wednesday morning or a Friday morning as it is on a Sunday morning. Because on Sunday morning, sometimes we just naturally get into that state of mind. You wake up, you get dressed, you get prepared. There's a process you have because you're going to church. I know that for us, as a kid growing up, we always had a process. It was wake up, get dressed, mom had to get clothes for you, and then you fight with your siblings, and then on the way to church, your parents threaten your life so that you don't look as evil and as horrible as the whole morning went when you get to church. That was our process. It's just a natural state, and when we start talking about worship, we always really have we desire our hearts to worship in the right things. We want our kids to desire and worship the right things. However, the Bible talks a lot about idols and idolatry, which is where we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to actually be in Daniel 3, so if you have your Bible and you open up to that, we'll be kind of walking through systematically to kind of listen to the story of where they're at. But we're talking about idols. Now, in the Old Testament, there is a lot about idols. And the idols that they talked about in the Old Testament are typically this physical feature, physical statue, or some kind of an erection of something that you would put up so that everybody would see it. It was a statue in typical framework. The definition I want to use of an idol, though, for us, for you and I today, the biblical definition is that an idol is anything that we come to rely on for some blessing or help or guidance in place of wholehearted reliance on the true and living God. Now, we can talk about idols in the Old Testament. We'll be talking about a physical idol this morning. But on top of that, Jesus describes that and expands that with idolatry. Idolatry is what happens in our heart. And it's typically what happens based on something that we see. So I put a Green Bay Packer jersey up on the front just to give you guys a reference that doesn't mean that every Green Bay Packer fan is in idolatry. It just means that they could be. So that's the difficulty with idolatry is that we have to figure out where our heart is first to know if it's an actual issue or not. But Jesus over and over again warns us of this. All throughout the New Testament as well, it says, stay away from idols, resist idols, flee from idols, because it's idols that will cause our worship to go someplace it's not supposed to be. If you guys remember in the Old Testament too, in Numbers, you have this picture and image of the people of Israel who are sick and bitten by all these snakes. And Moses crafts this bronze serpent and puts it on a staff. And everybody who looks at this idol is saved. And if you don't look at this idol, you're not saved. The thing that we rarely get to is that's in Numbers. If you continue on and get into 2 Kings, we actually learn of when Hezekiah destroys the snake, the serpent, on this staff, this idol. Because it says this. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. And he broke in many pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. I didn't probably say that exactly right, but you guys get what I'm talking about. So the serpent itself is this idol that at the very beginning has this saving nature. And when you look at it, you are saved. But then later on, pretty quickly, it gets to the point where people are burning incense to it. There's some kind of worship going on after that that shouldn't be there. God describes this idolatry that has happened to this image that was created for a good purpose that was turned into something it wasn't supposed to. So in Daniel, we're going to talk about idols and idolatry. But in Daniel, we see that we first have to kind of get and figure out where Daniel is. Daniel is a Jew, and he has some friends. His friends that we typically remember are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's a different name because their real names were Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. So they're renamed. They had their Jewish names, then they had their Babylonian names. Because they were in Israel, and Israel is warned that if they continue through idolatry, that the nation of Babylon is going to come and they're going to exile them out, take them and enslave them in their country. Well, just so happens that in Babylon, it's Nebuchadnezzar at the time who is the one who goes and takes a lot of these people out of Jerusalem and takes them to Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar is never really known as a good guy. He's always a pretty evil and ruthless guy. There's a lot in 2 Kings that you can learn about Nebuchadnezzar, but he's one who comes in, and his whole purpose is to make everybody submit underneath his rule and reign. He wants the one world government, the one rule order, and he wants to be in charge of everything. So King Nebuchadnezzar, as we get into the very beginning of Daniel, if you open to Daniel 1 even, just back up to a couple chapters, we'll start where Daniel is. Verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." So this is the time where Babylon comes, exiles out some of Israel, and they're going to be exiled for 70 years. It's in this amount of 70 years where it describes what he does next, and he takes some of these boys that he thinks are the best of the best. Because you're not going to put the worst of the worst up there, right? So you're going to put the best of the best, or is what he thinks of. And he takes these boys and he starts to brainwash them. First thing he does, he renames them, gives them all new names. In the book, you hear those. We'll use Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just because that's how it's told to us in the story in Daniel 3. But he renames them. He tries to educate them for 3 years and essentially brainwash them to his way of life in order to manipulate the other people that are in exile. If you take a bunch of slaves and capture them, one of the easiest ways to get them all to listen is to take a couple of them, raise them up, brainwash them, and then have the instruction come from their own people. So it's an easy way to manipulate, and Nebuchadnezzar is really good at this. Well, in Daniel chapter 1, we are described a story and a picture of Daniel and his friends not wanting to be brainwashed or manipulated. They're even wined and dined with the king's food in the palace. And they say, no, we don't want to be wined and dined with your food in the palace because you're giving them to all these different gods that you have in Babylon. Babylon is polytheist, so they have lots of different gods, and they sacrifice their food to these different kings, and then they get to eat it. Well, Daniel and his friends said, I don't want to eat that food. That seems wrong to us. So they tell the chief, hey, just give us vegetables and water, and that'll suffice. The chief says, there's no way. You can't have vegetables and water because you're just going to get skinnier. You're not going to be as strong. You're not going to be as useful, and the king's going to kill you and me. So Daniel said, well, just give us a few days. Let us work on this, 10 days, see what happens. Daniel and his friends get bigger and stronger by eating vegetables and water. Unique because that's not typically what happens. So the first miracle that happens in Daniel is because, if you went and just ate vegetables and water, you might be able to do really well. But do you realize how many vegetables you have to eat in order to get the calories you need to survive? I know some of you guys have no problem eating vegetables, And Cheryl hates vegetables, so like don't take vegetables to her house because she'll just bring them to my house anyway. So like there are people that just don't like vegetables anyway. But Daniel and his friends use this, and God reveals himself to the king through this miracle. Well, in verse 17 of chapter 1, it says, "As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams." God gave Daniel and his friends this other miraculous ability to just be wise. It says 10 times wiser than everybody else. They're just really wise for their age, really mature for their age. They're even to the point where King Nebuchadnezzar, who has all these different magicians and people that he can go find counsel from, they're wiser than they are, by far. So King Nebuchadnezzar has already found these boys to be quite intriguing, and he kind of puts them into a special place. Chapter 2 continues on, and King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it's this picture where King Nebuchadnezzar comes to all of his wise men, his own wise men, and says, "Hey, I had this dream, and it was frightening. It was scary. The problem is you have to tell me what my dream was, and then you also have to interpret it." All the magicians are saying, "Absolutely, we can't do that. Like, how about you just tell us the dream, and then we'll interpret it from there." Have you ever done that with like a friend where all of a sudden you just like, try to get more information so that you can try to give them some good advice? Like it's an easy tactic that if you know about somebody, you can probably make some good guesses. The problem with these wise men is they don't want to guess with this dream because if they get the guess wrong, they're dead. So Nebuchadnezzar is pretty ruthless, it seems like, even in what he desires. He wants things to happen that are impossible. And yet, even in this picture, he goes to get Daniel and sends off for Daniel because Daniel is also part of the wise men at this point, him and his friends, and he's going to kill them as well. And Daniel and his friends set aside and they go to pray and they ask God for help, and God reveals to him in a dream what the dream was and the interpretation. Well, when Daniel gets in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel says, "I can't tell you what your dream is, but I know a God who can." And then he continues to tell him exactly what God revealed to him. King Nebuchadnezzar sees this, and he immediately lifts Daniel and his friends up to this place because he has been able to do something that nobody else can possibly do. This seems to be a miracle above miracles. So he elevates them again in their roles, and he makes Daniel, he gave him many gifts, it says in the end of chapter 2, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel's in charge of everybody. And then Daniel made a request to the king, and then he appoints Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well with a little promotion. This is where we get into chapter 3. Daniel and his friends get elevated and promoted from their position, and then chapter 3 happens. So read with me in chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height with which was 60 cubits, and width 6 cubits, and he set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Do you guys know how big a cubit is? Yeah, that's not our measuring tool. I don't expect you guys to know that. It was hard for me too. I had to look it up. It's 90 foot. See, Claire even knows. It is the distance between your elbow and your pinky or your middle finger, and it's roughly a few feet. So the cubit that they have essentially calculates out to be a 90 foot tall by 9 feet wide is what this image is. Now, if I were to ask you guys today, do we have idols today? I don't know if you guys would necessarily pick up on all of them, but we do. There are some that are out there. There's one in Brazil that's called Christ the Redeemer that was built. That is probably, I just picked this one because it's the closest one in height. Okay? So if you take out the little pedestal at the bottom and you just use the statue itself, from the little bottom to the very top of the head is 98 feet. So again, 8 feet taller than what this other image that Nebuchadnezzar made. And it wasn't necessarily a statue of a person. It just says in Daniel chapter 3 it was an image. But this kind of gives you a picture of how big it is. And if you're going to create this image, this big, vast statue, like what is a statue for? Would you ever put up a statue and then hide it? It doesn't seem that way. King Nebuchadnezzar, that wasn't his goal, his intention. His intention was for everybody to see it. And the thing is that if you want everybody to see it, it's easier if you force people to see it. You can put it up on a high hill so everybody has to see it. Or you could even go to the point where Nebuchadnezzar goes. Nebuchadnezzar continues in this way where he has everyone follow this ritual. Verse 7, he sets up this statue, and then what he does is, therefore at that time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations of men of every language, fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. This was something that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to have happen whenever the music played, which seems to be interesting because whenever the music plays, like if you ever played that game, you know, where you set up some chairs and you dance around the chairs, and when the music stops, you got to go find a chair. Like that game stinks when you're the last person. Do you know when else that game stinks? Is when there's a statue set up, and every time the music plays, you have to quit whatever you're doing. If you're a farmer, you got to stop what you're doing. If you're a banker, you got to stop what you're doing. If you're a doctor, you got to stop what you're doing. I mean, think of that if you're all of a sudden the surgeon and the music starts playing and you got to put your scalpel down under open heart surgery and you're like, sorry, can't continue on. I got to go and worship this image here. I'm going to bow down, worship this image. Just lay on the table for a little bit longer. I'll get back to you. There wasn't a stipulation where people of certain criteria had to worship and others didn't have to. This was every single person. It says of every language, every nation. Didn't matter what it was. If you were in Babylon and you were anywhere near this big statue that he had created, you had to bow down and worship. Now, how long do you bow down and worship? As long as the music plays. We have no idea. That could be fun for some of you guys. We like music. The problem is when you have to do it and you're forced to do it, who's likely to do something that you're forced to do? Anybody? Kids, do you like to do stuff that you're forced to do? Not typically. I know my kids don't. That's just not something that is typical. Now, from this, the story continues in verse 8 and says, for this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. That everybody was supposed to bow down and worship this image, and yet some people were not doing that. So you have like the sibling effect. How many times that like mom and dad tell you, hey, you guys need to go out and rake leaves. And then if one of the siblings isn't raking leaves, what happens? You go tattle. You go tell on them. And you say, hey, they're not raking. They got to do it too. Because, you know, if you're down there and you're having to do all that worshiping, like, why wouldn't everybody else have to? It's either good for all or good for none. Now, in this story, this is the part where they find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are the three Jews they're talking about. Now, the stipulation that the king had as well is that if you didn't bow down and worship, you got thrown into the fiery furnace. Now, I don't know if you guys understand the craziness that comes out of that, but if you were a parent and said, hey, you don't do your chores, I'm cutting off a finger. Like, that's kind of nuts. And yet, King Nebuchadnezzar, it's hey, you bow down and worship this image, or I'm throwing you in a fiery furnace. Not just a furnace. It's not a hot air furnace. This is a fiery furnace. One with fire. Yeah, see, there you go. You finally laugh. This is serious, right? Now, in this story too, Nebuchadnezzar, he's like this controlling, manipulating king who always gets his way. The problem is that he doesn't quite understand and know who the one true God is. He has all these other small polytheist kind of gods that they have, that they worship, and they kind of bow down to them because they always feel like these other gods are really what are giving them blessing and power. For instance, one of the gods that were prominent in Babylon was Marduk. And Marduk was the god that was an agricultural deity, but also he was called Marduk the Protector. And he was the guy who essentially, Nebuchadnezzar, as he went and fought wars, he would worship Marduk, and then he would go out and he'd win these wars. So then when he came back, who did they praise? Marduk. Because obviously, Nebuchadnezzar's reign and his battle winningness had to have come from this god Marduk. Do you guys know who Marduk is? I didn't think so. That's because he actually gets conquered by Alexander the Great later on when Greece starts to thrive. Alexander the Great actually completely destroys the statue of Marduk, and Marduk ceases to exist from that time. But at the time, there were all these gods that they would go and worship and bow down to in hopes that, hey, if I go worship and give them food and other stuff like that, that these gods are going to give us agricultural wealth, might be some other physical wealth, some health, any other thing that they possibly could ask for. They would go to these gods. Now, this is when the story gets interesting because they bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the king. And the king gives them a second chance. He says, hey, I'm going to have the music play one more time. And if you bow down, it'll be very well for you. If you don't bow down, it's still going to the fiery furnace. And this is where we catch back up when it comes to verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar asks him and says, who can deliver you out of my hand? You're in front of me. I'm going to throw you in the fire. What God is going to deliver you? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, hey, we don't serve your gods. You don't know who our God is. Because if you knew who our God was, you'd be afraid. And again, God's going to deliver us out of your hand. One way or another, we don't have to deal with you. But he's either going to do it through a miraculous encounter and give somebody a blessing through this fiery furnace, or we're going to die. And our lives are going to be taken, but we're still not going to bow down to your gods. At that point, too, like kids, these boys are pretty young. When your parents aren't around, is it easy to compromise on your values? Adults, same question. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their mom and dad aren't around to catch them. I mean, all Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to do is just bow down, and their life is saved. In fact, they could even justify and say, hey, if we bow down to this image, then we're going to live, and then we'll live longer so that we can tell people about who God is. Like, God, don't you need us alive so that we can do your work here? Instead, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't do that. They don't compromise in their values. They instead say, King, even if God doesn't save us, even if God doesn't deliver us, that doesn't diminish who he is. What it does is we understand that there's something after this life. There's something eternally. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have this intriguing stipulation from the king. And the thing that they come down to is that we're supposed to trust the Lord even if God doesn't do what you think is the right plan. There's a a trust that we have to have with God, that even if we think that God's not doing what we think ought to happen, we still have to trust that God's got the plan and that He's right and that He's good. The question is what is God's plan? Well, God's plan from the beginning of time, if you remember, even in the Ten Commandments, He said, don't bow down to any other god. Don't worship any other god, for there's only one God. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego know this. They've learned this. Before they got exiled, they have some type of knowledge of the Scriptures, and they come to say, hey, we've been told this isn't good, and we're not going to do it. Even if it was to save our life, we're not going to bow down to your image. And then this is what continues after this. Verse 19 says, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it usually was heated. So instead, the king just gets more mad. King Nebuchadnezzar is so frustrated and mad, he goes, okay, make it hotter. Now, I don't think they actually had a thermometer and they actually made it 7 times hotter exactly. What the Scripture is trying to tell us is that he was so mad that they said, just make it hotter. Because back then they would have used coal, and coal can get pretty hot. Now, I don't know if anybody would contest that walking through this miracle that God performs, that somebody could say, oh, well, it wasn't that hot of a fire. They were able to walk out because it wasn't that hot. Like, isn't that kind of crazy to think of? But instead, Daniel makes sure he puts in the fact that the king was so mad that he just lit the fire as hot as he possibly could. How do we know he lit the fire as hot as he possibly could? Because this is what happens. He says that they ended up tying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're completely tied. They can't walk. They have to get carried to get thrown into the furnace. And it says, the furnace was extremely hot. The flame of fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're tied up, hands and everything else bound, so they can't walk, so they get grabbed, and they get thrown into the furnace. And the guys that had to throw them in the furnace die. They don't live. The fire is that hot that they die instantly. There is no question of whether there's a miracle going on or not. We know there's a miracle. You can't survive a fire, even if it's a cold fire, right? Like that even exists. A fire is a fire. And these guys yet get thrown in, and it says as soon as they get tossed in, they fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. And then follow along with me again in verse 24. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. And he said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? And they replied to the king, you guys can probably imagine this, all of the people around. He had called everybody to come worship this image. So all the governors, the prefects, the satraps, all these high officials. This is the same thing as governors and mayors. If you had any kind of high political position, you were there to watch. And all of a sudden, King Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, wasn't there 3 guys? And everybody else around goes, yep, you're right, king. He said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Now again, Nebuchadnezzar is one who's a polytheist. He worshiped many different gods. So this picture of a son of the gods, we sometimes take as, was this an angel with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Or was it Jesus himself? And the thing is the text doesn't really tell us. But it also doesn't really matter, does it? We know that there was 3 guys thrown into the fire. The guys that threw them in the fire are dead. And now all of a sudden the king, this isn't Daniel and the Jews that are saying, hey, we saw God in that fire. These are the Gentiles, the non-believers. These are the guys that don't believe in their God at all. And they're going, there's a 4th one in there. And he looks like the son of the gods. So whatever that is, it's pretty miraculous. And yet, Nebuchadnezzar says he came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out. and you're servants of the Most High God, and come here. It says, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on their bodies or these men, nor was their hair on their heads singed. I know you guys think that that's funny, but do you guys know how easy it is to singe hair? It's easy. You go out with the wood boiler and you throw a little log of wood into the fire and get close, the little ends of your hair singe, even on your beard. And even when they singe, you know what happens next? They stink. Your hair smells when it gets singed like that, which is why it's quite amazing when they say that these men, the bodies weren't damaged, the hair of their head wasn't singed, their trousers not even damaged, and they didn't even have the smell of fire on them. I mean, we can't even come up with something this good. When we come up with our own movies with a superhero, they all crash down to earth and they come out naked. Look at Superman. Superman comes from this other planet. He's supposed to be some kind of great guy. Come up, he's naked. Terminator, naked. We can't even come up with the fact that these trousers wouldn't be singed. And yet, the Bible is pretty miraculous in this fact that it didn't even smell. I was burning trash the other day, had a little fire burning from some wood and some other stuff, and Luke and I were down there, and I walked just in front to have to kind of throw some more wood in the fire, and immediately went up to the house, and I had clothes on and whatnot, and it's usually after you shower, and then all of a sudden you come back and you just take a whiff of your shirt, and you're like, man, it smells like a campfire. You immediately smell it. It doesn't take any time whatsoever. And yet these guys weren't next to the fire, in the smoke. They're in the fire, in the midst, in the middle. And yet God keeps them from everything. Why is this important? Well, in the New Testament, even Jesus says that when you become one of his children, that not a hair on your head will be damaged. That's the miraculous part. Is that when you know who Jesus Christ is, it says that he's the one that holds and keeps you, all of you, even the hair on your head. I know it's a funny joke because I'm bald, but that's actually not the scriptural point. The scriptural point is that God can protect us no matter what. And then, after that, verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. This is unique when it comes down to him being the one they defied, and he was the one that was ready to kill them and said, who's going to deliver you? And now Nebuchadnezzar answers his own question. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is exactly who delivered them. And it seems like he's at this point where King Nebuchadnezzar is also, he sees the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as worthy, as great. It almost seems like there might be this conversion for Nebuchadnezzar. You have to keep reading to chapter 4 to continue on to that. I won't give you the teaser at the very end, but he starts to eat grass and stuff out with the animals. He's like a wild animal out in the pasture. So, is he converted through this? No, doesn't seem that way. He was able to encounter God and yet wasn't changed. But he does do some interesting things. He said, therefore, verse 29, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their house is reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Again, Nebuchadnezzar goes to this extreme thing. Hey, now you got to worship Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God, and if you don't do that, I'm going to tear you limb from limb. He's just this brutal guy, isn't he? And yet that is somewhat kind of the imagery of what happens if you don't put your faith in Christ. One day, you will be torn limb from limb. One day, you will experience a fire that's going to be very, very great. One day, that fire is going to be a lot worse, and the hair on your head's going to get singed, and you're going to get burnt. You're going to smell like fire, and it's going to be horrible. So the whole picture and the point of this is when you look at this idol that they put into place, idolatry is the thing that happens when all of a sudden you make that idol or anything in that place above God. Now, when we talk about physical idols, that's why I was kind of going between physical idols and not, because the Bible talks a lot more after this between physical idols and the difference between idolatry of the heart. That we all have idolatry and there's things that we worship. And in fact, all throughout the week there's things that we worship. The question really comes down to more of what place or position does that idolatry take in your heart? Is that idolatry a compromise where you can say, I can worship the one true God and I can worship money. I can worship the one true God and I can worship my career. Or is God saying, there's only one God, and no matter what you do, you shouldn't lift anything else above who I am? So idolatry, the unique part is that like culturally, we don't have a lot of statues per se in the United States. That's just not something culturally that we have a whole lot of. If you go into like a lot of the Eastern cultures, they still do. Like if you're a Hindu or Buddhist or something like that, there is actually a lot of idols that people you would have in your house and stuff like that. So last night I actually was like looking around our house to try to see if there was any kind of idol that we had set up in the house or anything that we kind of held dear. And I was having a hard time really kind of coming up with that. But there are a lot of things that can take this place in our hearts. For some of us, it's pretty easy, and we get into these fancy devices, and we just get consumed by them. I know I struggle with it at times, for sure. Idolatry is something that just completely distracts us and takes all of our worship and devotion away from God. And I know that sometimes I probably get into watching like farm videos, probably a little bit more than what I should be doing, reading my Bible or something better than that, playing with my kids maybe. But phones can be a big distraction. I mean, internet, social media, things like that, those are the things that just cause us to stumble. Because a lot of times they sneak in real slow, don't they? They sneak in to the point where they creep into our heart, and we don't really know that we've elevated them above God until all of a sudden we kind of look back and we're like, yeah, my kids are like graduated, grown up, and gone out of the house, and I can't all of a sudden go back and spend that time that I wish I would have when they were younger. If you're a parent, you probably at some point, even if you spend a lot of time with your kids, at some point you probably have felt that. You probably have felt that there are times where you're distracted and not focusing on what you ought to focus on. But there are things that are good in our life that can take that distraction. Sometimes it could even be our family that is that distraction. So what I'm trying to make sure that we understand is even like with the Green Bay Packer jersey, just because you like the Green Bay Packers doesn't mean you're in idolatry. Idolatry is something that happens in our heart. It's not something that just everybody sees. So let me help explain it just a little bit better. When Heather and I were first married, Heather has had a lot of surgeries. And in those surgeries, we go in, and one of the most important things you need in a surgeon or in a surgery is a surgeon. So you go and you find the right guy. They're supposed to perform the surgery. I expect the surgeon to take care of my wife. I also hope and expect that the surgery always goes well. And yet, like when we were first married, I always found that she would have these surgeries, and she would come out of surgery, and I would be telling the story of what happened. And I would probably talk more about the amazement of the surgeon being awesome than I ever talked about God doing the work through that surgeon. And we can so easily get on to this point of saying, hey, like, yeah, this surgeon is the top of his field. He's the best of the best. There's only 3 in the country. And guess what? Heather had that surgeon. The surgery went well, and cancer was taken away at that moment, and we were okay. Most of the time in that story, rarely did I actually come and say, hey, God worked through that surgeon. God's the one who directed us to that surgeon, helped the surgeon's hand, got the cancer away from Heather, but ultimately it was God at work the whole time. We can easily say the same story, and we can be doing 2 different things. We can elevate God, and we're in the rightful place that he deserves, or we can be elevating something else. And do you want to put the definition of idol up there again, just so that way we kind of get another one? It's anything that we can come to rely on for some blessing, help, guidance in the place of wholehearted reliance. I mean, that can be anything. That's the danger of idolatry, is that it's not just this warning of like, hey, kids, be careful from cell phones and internet and these here's this list. It's, hey, anything can become idolatry. Your spouse can become idolatry. If you all of a sudden elevate and worship your spouse more than you worship God, by biblical definition, that's idolatry. That's the danger with idolatry, is that there is to be no compromise. Now, with that being said, we struggle with idolatry. We're always going to struggle with idolatry. If you feel like you've conquered in one area of your life some kind of idolatry, just wait another week. Something else will come into place. So the question is what do we do? What do we do about this? Well, the thing that we do is that we have to understand and know that there's only one person who can deliver us from the sin and shame that we hold. There's only one God who can deliver us. And it's not any of the gods that Babylon tried to put their hope and trust in, but it's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The God who can deliver people out of a fiery furnace without any harm to them. And even if he doesn't get you through life without any harm, we still trust him. You will experience and go through some difficulty in life where you come into place where something happens. You struggle. Your faith is either shaken, or you doubt, or you get to the place where all of a sudden you just transition your faith and you try to trust in something else. And I pray that any other surgery that I may have, or Heather may have, or the kids may have, that I always go and I cling to the one true living God. And I don't try to cling to anything else. I don't put my hope in the fact that the surgeon's the best of the best, or that I'm going to hope that surgeon does well. And it usually comes out in those later stories when you tell other people as far as where your heart is at. And the good news is that God sent his Son to be the ultimate deliverer. That God sent Jesus Christ for you and I to have that relationship with. There's no other relationship in our life that's more important than the one that we have with Jesus Christ. And anything that gets in the way of that, we just need to stop. We need to resist those things. We need to cut them out. We need to remove them from us, because those are the things that are distracting us from knowing the one true God. Now in this, as we close, we're going to close with a song, Come Thou Fount. And in that song, I don't know if you guys remember, but at the very end, it talks about being prone to wander. And I think that that's the case for all of us. We're all prone to wander. And yet, maybe this for you today, this morning, it's a time to admit some of that. Ask God for forgiveness of some of the idolatry in your heart, and ask God to renew you, to redeem you, to deliver you out of the enslavement that comes from idolatry. So I'll pray, and as I pray, I'll just have the band come up, and then we're going to sing that song, Come Thou Fount. And even if we're prone to wander, we come and we cling to the one true living God. Dear Heavenly Father, we just ask and pray this morning that you're with us.